From Liberation to Legitimacy, Justice, Memory, and Democratic Identity in West Germany, 1945 to 1965. I'm John Schufelt. After Germany's defeat in 1945, the Western occupation zones faced not only physical ruin, but a deeper moral and political crisis. Bombed cities, displaced people, and broken infrastructure, and the defeated state had to be rebuilt. So did courts, ministries, political parties, and eventually a constitution. The new federal republic also faced a harder question. How could democracy become legitimate after dictatorship, genocide, and total war? West Germany had to show that its institutions were not merely the Third Reich under a new name. It needed the public narrative that condemned Nazism as criminal and finished while still accommodating a society in which millions had participated in, tolerated, or benefited from the regime. Between 1945 and 1965, West Germany built democratic legitimacy by turning justice into selective politics of memory. Denazification, amnesty, reintegration, war crime trials, and the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials shaped how the Nazi past could be remembered in a democratic present. Justice mattered not because it produced a full moral reckoning, but because it made accountability visible while making the past politically manageable. To show that worked, I will move through 5 connected stages of West Germany's early post-war reckoning. This presentation is focused case study of West Germany from 1945 to 65. It does not cover all of post-war Europe or a full history of Holocaust memory. Instead, it examines the overlap between justice, collective memory, and democratic legitimacy. The argument moves in 5 steps. First, I begin with a post-war crisis and explain why legitimacy was so fragile after defeat. Second, I discuss denazification. Third, I examine amnesty and reintegration. Fourth, I turn to the trials, especially Nuremberg, which created a legal language of responsibility. And finally, I discuss the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, which began in 1963. The place to begin is a basic post-war problem. West Germany needed legitimacy after collapse. Germany's defeat left it more than in ruins. It left a crisis of authority. The Nazi state had collapsed, but the society that became West Germany had not been separate from Nazism. Some Germans have been perpetrators or Nazi party members. Others have benefited, stayed silent, or suffered bombing, hunger, displacement, captivity, and the war's destruction. This created a difficult problem for democratic reconstruction. The new federal republic had to build courts, ministries, elections, and parties, but institutions alone could not solve the questions of moral legitimacy. The new democracy had to persuade Germans and outsiders that it marked a real break from the Third Reich. It had to show the post-war state rested on law, rights, and restraint rather than dictatorship, racial ideology, and arbitrary violence. Legitimacy depended on memory as much as administration. West Germany had to condemn Nazism clearly enough to establish democratic credibility, but not so broadly that accountability made the new state impossible to govern. The tension shaped the early Federal Republic. This is why justice became so important. It was not only a legal process, it became a way of managing memory. The central idea of this presentation is that justice and memory did different kinds of work, but in post-war West Germany, they became closely connected. The legal system asked a specific question: who could be punished? It dealt with charges, evidence, trials, verdicts, and legal categories. Memory asked a broader, more difficult question: what could society live with? How could Germans explain their relationship to a criminal regime without making democracy impossible? West Germany's answer was neither full denial nor complete confession. Instead, it developed a selective process of reckoning. Some forms of guilt became public, some individuals were prosecuted, some documents and judgments created an official record. This is what I mean by justice as memory politics. Justice made accountability visible and allowed West Germany to say that Nazism had been judged and rejected, but it also narrowed responsibility into forms the state could manage. It turned a vast moral catastrophe into administrative and legal categories. That made the Nazi past politically usable, but it also left reckoning incomplete. The first major example of this selective reckoning was denazification. Denazification initially promised a sharp break with Nazism. The goal was to remove former Nazis from positions of influence and purify the institutions a new democracy needed. A democratic state could not simply inherit the personnel and habits of a dictatorship without some form of cleansing. In practice, denazifications quickly ran into reality. Nazi party membership had been widespread, and many experienced administrators had compromised past. The Western zones also faced scarcity, reconstruction, displacement, and an emerging Cold War. The state could not function if every implicated person were permanently excluded. Denazification mattered less if it had fully succeeded than because it publicly marked a break. It allowed the Allies and emerging Federal Republic to say Nazism had been judged and rejected. But its limits mattered too. Denazification translated the moral guilt into administrative categories: major offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated persons. These categories made accountability manageable while softening the larger problem of collective responsibility. That redirection became even clearer in the Adenauer era when reintegration became central to the new democracy. During the Adenauer era, West Germany turned denazification's limits into a broader politics of reintegration. Former Nazis were increasingly treated as citizens to bring back into the democratic society. Leaders framed this as necessary for recovery, administrative efficiency, and anti communist stability. This was not simply forgetting, it was reframing. The emphasis shifted from punishment to recovery, from exclusion to consensus, and from guilt to usefulness. Amnesty measures and restored officials reshaped public discussion of the Nazi past. Adenauer's language was both policy and performance. By stressing stability and reintegration, he helped define public memory. The Republican Empire could not rebuild if it remained trapped in punishment. In the 1950s, many West Germans focused on their own suffering, bombing, displacement, captivity, hunger, and recovery. These memories often centered on German victimhood over Jewish persecution or perpetrator responsibility. Amnesty and reintegration created a usable past that made democratic recovery possible while keeping complicity at a distance. At the same time, the trials continued to provide a public language through which Nazism could be condemned. War crime trials gave the post-war order a legal language for rejecting Nazism. The key early example was Nuremberg. The International Military Tribunal created a vocabulary of crimes against humanity, war crimes, aggressive war, and individual responsibility. It showed that state power cannot shield political leaders from judgment and that obedience did not erase guilt. This was crucial for democratic legitimacy. Trials defined Nazism as criminal, not simply defeated. They created a public record and showed that law and procedure would replace arbitrary violence. But Nuremberg's authority was complicated. It was a landmark proceeding, but it was conducted by the victors. Many Germans saw it as external judgment rather than self-examination. Trials made responsibility visible, but they also narrated. Courts judged defendants, charges, and evidence and verdicts. They were less able to judge social combination, silence, and benefit. Trials gave West Germany a legal grammar of responsibility focused on individual guilt. It could identify publishable crimes, but it could not fully answer what made the Nazi regime socially possible. That leads directly to this problem of containment. Legal accountability helped democracy survive, but it also limited deeper reflection. The individualization of guilt became a key tool of early West German legitimacy. On one hand, it showed that the new state respected law. The federal public could point to courts, evidence, procedures, and verdicts as proof that it was different from the Third Reich. On the other hand, individual guilt located responsibility in a smaller group of defendants. If guilt belonged mainly to perpetrators, broader society could avoid deeper reflection on participation, silence, accommodation, and benefit. This is what I call containment. Legal accountability made guilt official and visible, but also manageable. Post-war Germans did not move smoothly from denial to responsibility. They argued over suffering and deception, guilt, and belonging in the new republic. Societies remember traumatic past through institutions, rituals, narratives, and silences that decide which facts become politically meaningful. In West Germany, justice became one of those institutions of memory. It produced records, verdicts, categories, and rituals of judgment. That was a central bargain. Justice made accountability visible while making the Nazi past containable. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials revealed that the past could not remain contained forever. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials marked a turning point because they brought the Holocaust into West German public life more directly. Beginning in 1963, the trials folded inside the Federal Republic's own legal and media institutions. This made them different from Nuremberg, which some had dismissed as victor's justice. Frankfurt was hard to dismiss because it took place through West German courts, newspapers, and public debate. The trials made Auschwitz visible not only as symbols of Nazi evil, but as a system of bureaucratic murder. Survivor testimony, court records, and press coverage show that genocide required more than a few monstrous leaders. It also required guards and clerks, doctors, transport systems, administrators, and habits of obedience. This was deeply unsettling. It challenged a comforting divide between criminal Nazis and normal post-war society. Defendants often seemed disturbingly ordinary. Their biographies connected mass murder to everyday German life, making the trials both legal events and public memory events. The trials matter because they expose the limits of earlier selective accountability. Frankfurt did not begin West German reckoning, but it changed its terms. It forced attention towards Jewish victims, bureaucratic genocide, and the questions earlier justice had contained. This brings us to a larger conclusion. West German democracy was built on an incomplete reckoning. The main conclusion is that West Germany became democratic not by fully overcoming the Nazi past, but by governing through an incomplete reckoning with it. Justice gave the Federal Republic a language of rupture and responsibility. Denazification, amnesty debates, trials, and the Frankfurt Auschwitz proceedings helped the Republic define itself against the Third Reich. But they did so unevenly. They made some forms of guilt public while leaving broader complicity unresolved. They allowed West Germany to claim moral distance from Nazism while preserving enough social continuity to govern. Selective justice was both a foundation and a failure. It was a foundation because it helped democracy stabilize and gave the new state legal and moral tools to separate itself from Nazism. But it was also a failure because it postponed deeper confrontation. It made the Nazi past administratable, prosecutable, and survivable, but not resolved. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trial exposed the limits of that settlement. They showed that the past could not be escaped through a law alone. It had to be remembered, contested, and repeatedly returned to public life. West German democratic identity was built not on a clean break, but on an ongoing struggle over memory, guilt, and legitimacy. Its early democracy rested on controlled accountability, a partial reckoning that made legitimacy possible while ensuring the past would return. Thank you.